Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. So earlier this year, Austin, Texas rolled out a new service that allows 911 callers to specify if they need mental health services. This then allows the dispatcher to transfer the call to an on-site mental health professional who does a clinical screening and a triage to determine if they can perhaps send out clinicians to respond to the call without police involvement. Or they can determine that there's an emergency that requires a police or emergency medical response. Now, Austin's expanded mobile crisis outreach team is part of a broader movement in jurisdictions across the country intended to divert mental health crisis response away from armed law enforcement and towards trained civilian specialists who are better equipped to handle these sorts of situations. As we've seen in countless incidents over the past few years, police responding to mental health calls only make the problem worse. They escalate the crisis. They make things more violent, more frightening. Cops are very quick to escalate any situation, especially for an already tense situation where a mental health crisis may be involved. The likelihood of resorting to violence by police is extremely high. This is something we all know from watching the news and being human in this world, but the numbers back it up. 1/4 of all people killed by police are experiencing problems related to mental illness at that time. This is especially a big concern in Austin, where a 2018 audit found that out of the largest 15 cities in America, Austin's police department had the highest per capita rate of fatal police shootings involving people experiencing a mental health crisis. Now, keep in mind, even in the best case scenario where police may not physically harm a person in crisis, a law enforcement response is still terrifying. It is more likely to lead to arrest and incarceration and all sorts of extremely negative fallout for everyone involved, all of which, of course, further destabilizes individuals and makes a mental health crisis worse and is like a life bomb full of emotional health shrapnel just going off in your front yard. So far, Austin's expanded mobile crisis outreach team has seen promising results, with 86% of the calls transferred over for mental health services resolved without the need for police. And that's data as of February. The city is currently in the midst of plans, of course, to further expand the program using around $11 million that has been diverted from the Austin Police Department's budget. Joining me now to talk about what's going on in Austin, we have once again Austin's City Council member, Gregorio Casar. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for talking about this really important topic.
So I want to go into further detail about how the program is operating in Austin, but I wanted to sort of back up before we did that and talk about how you were able to get this off the ground. Can you give us some insight into the conversations you had around the expanded mobile crisis outreach team, which is a mouthful, and tell us how you were able to settle on funding it with reallocated police money?
This is something that we could never have gotten done if it weren't for the civil rights movement and millions of people marching in the last year demanding change. But we got this done here in the last year and got this expanded in the last year really on a foundation of years of work before it. And unfortunately, on years of tragedy before it. When I was a brand new Austin City Council member, I got a chance to speak at Premier High School for their graduation back in 2015. And David Joseph was an Austinite, a bright, promising, beloved teenager at that school at the time. And just a few months later, on the worst day of his life, David had 911 called on him. He was having a mental health crisis. He was unarmed and naked, and video footage clearly shows that just within a few moments of police being the people that responded to that call, that they shot and killed David so needlessly and tragically, when the city really should have been providing care to him, when our response that was supposed to be for public safety actually did exactly the opposite and took his young life. It was just so devastating for our entire community and really changed the way that so many of us thought about 911 and thought about policing here in Austin well before the killing of George Floyd. And so part of the goal has been to say that police aren't the solution to mental health issues. Police aren't Just like they aren't the solution to addiction or aren't the solution to homelessness, police aren't going to be the best trained responders for this, and in fact can make matters so much worse. And so shortly after his killing, we had this audit that actually showed that this was a systemic issue in Austin. We were killing more people per capita than any of the other big cities in mental health crisis. And we started saying we need to build an alternative. But it was always so hard to fully fund that alternative because so many city funds were generally going just to keeping the lights on and to growing the police budget. And so here in the last year, because people were asking for us to think of alternatives to policing in so many areas and to think about not just continuing to invest in mass incarceration and over-policing, that created the opportunity for us to say, instead of hiring some police officers, why don't we hire the necessary medics and clinical staff so that we can respond to these other 911 calls in a way that protects civil rights and actually makes people more safe.
So yeah, I really want to highlight that because I think when we think of where the money comes from, when we cabin this as a mental health crisis response, it's very common for cities and counties to say, oh, well, that money should come out of our mental health services budget. When in fact, mental health services needs every penny. Like the people who are not doing this work now are the police. And so it makes a lot of sense that you pulled it out of the police budget. I just wanted to highlight that because I'm going to ask you a question later involving giving advice to other jurisdictions. And I want to sort of put that in your head for a question I'm going to ask you in a minute. But before we get there, I'd love for you to kind of tell us like the nitty gritty. How are the teams composed? Who's on these teams? What do you see as their biggest accomplishments thus far? And do you have any sort of early success stories you'd like to share?
Yeah, essentially how it works is that in Austin, you can call 911 now and hear, do you need police, fire, EMS, or mental health? So we've added that fourth option for people to opt into because we have found that we have over 500,000 911 calls any given year in Austin, and around 10% of those have a mental health component. And so why keep sending police out to those calls if we can have just a fourth option for people for mental health services to bring those unarmed mental health first responders to a call? So we have teams of medics, we have teams of clinicians that can go out and handle those calls. We also have clinicians inside the 911 call center so that as we're trying to triage a call, if somebody's not sure exactly which services they need, that we can send mental health services as necessary. Part of what we found actually at first during the rollout was because in part, really 911 was housed within the police department, that there might be a skew towards mental health services sort of being a backup service to police rather than being its own established service. And so we saw less utilization of the earlier programs we set up. So part of what we did in this new budget was not only staff up the level of clinicians and medics that could get to a call, but also pull 911 out of the police department, make it its own standalone 911 department so that really we could send the right responder to the right call. And in a case where there might need to be an emergency detention of a person, in some places, like in Oregon, a mental health responder is actually allowed under state law to make a detention. In Texas, that's not allowed. And so you might need a police officer. So we can set up situations where the mental health responder is in the lead position and the police officer serves more as backup rather than continuing to have a process where you have the police leading every interaction and the mental health thing sort of being more of an annex. And you don't want that because in some cases, really, you want the mental health response to lead.
I would like for cooler heads to lead basically any and every police interaction, if you're asking me, but thank you for pointing that out. You mentioned Oregon, you mentioned cahoots. I'm wondering, I know it's very, very early. We listed some stats at the top about the Austin program, but in terms of the quantitative picture of what you are seeing here and what you expect to see here, can you walk us through the numbers?
Yeah, we get over 500,000 911 calls in a year. We expect that about 10% of those would really be eligible for a mental health response. So our goal is to get to covering 100% of those calls through mental health first responders. We saw at first in our earlier program that only several hundred were being kicked over to mental health response. So that's part of why we've now established 911 separately from police so that we can hopefully in this year, because we essentially established this expanded program here just in the last few weeks, can really start getting to thousands of calls. We've seen from that data that you presented at the beginning that in the overwhelming majority of those cases, 85 to 95% of the cases, people don't have to get arrested, get diverted from jail entirely. You never have to have a police officer show up in the first place. So really, I think the goal is to get to 30, 40, 50,000 of those calls no longer needing a police officer response and being able to have this response. We also currently aren't covered fully 24/7, and so it needs continued funding. But we've really been able to ramp things up so much just by taking a look at our police budget and reorganizing funds. So really, we're at a place where the vast majority never need an arrest, never have police interaction, never wind up in jail. And we're now at a place where we can handle thousands of calls with a goal to getting to tens of thousands of calls.
So these are really exciting initial results. I mean, you're talking about like tens of thousands. I think you mentioned up to 50,000 people who would not need to have police contact, who would not be at risk of arrest, who would not be at risk of violence and death merely because of a mental health crisis. Are these
something to interject here is in the context of Texas and so many other places, deportation as well. We've seen instances where we've had a mental health call and a mental health officer, police officer shows up. And in one case of a young woman, Tanya Silva here locally, she didn't want to let go of her pet that she was holding on to. And the police officer kept telling her to let go of her pet. That escalated and wound up in her getting arrested. And for so many immigrant families, that's not just a horrible few nights in jail. She wound up with an ICE detainer and wound up almost getting deported if it weren't for activists speaking up. And so in some ways, it can lead to death and needless deportation if we aren't pairing the right response to the call. So in this way, I mean, those police officers could be investigating a violent offense. They could be getting to a major crime. And so we're essentially freeing up their time to do what it is that we need them most to do and not sending to the calls where they could make things so much worse.
It hadn't occurred to me the degree to which the fight against family separation at the border is intimately related to the way to the amount of police contact people are exposed to. But the idea that a mental health crisis response team could also be a means of diminishing family separation is an important point I haven't heard made yet. So building off of that, are these results, are these ideas, are these really good points you're making, are they swaying people? I mean, is there more support for this program now that it exists than there was when it was just an idea?
Yeah, what I'll tell others in their community, whether they are pushing their local city government to make change, or if you're a local policymaker yourself, is that there is this gap where it gets really hard, right? Between making the tough decision to reshape your budget and the program getting stood up. And we had to make it through that gap of time. But now it is so much more clear why making these interventions makes sense, because ultimately we're still providing public safety services. We're just providing smarter public safety services. I mean, in the past, the way it has been described to me is, a city essentially had an entire tool belt that they could pick from, but they just always chose the hammer, right? In every instance, almost just 911 call after 911 call, always picking the hammer, even though we know that there are so many other options that we could deploy, that we could choose from. And so now I think we can show that reducing police budgets doesn't just mean we leave a vacuum, but instead it means that we have better options for people that can make people safer, that can actually bring people what they want. Because when somebody sees someone in mental health crisis in this community, a lot of times folks don't know what to do. And what they've heard over and over again is, well, just call 911. And that's all folks know is available. Policing has been all that's been really presented to people as a solution from our joint community as expressed by our local government. And we have to think more creatively than that and say, you know what, people want to be able to help and to reach out. But there are folks that, don't want to call 911 and call the cops on their neighbor or on their family member or on themselves.
So building on that for a second, I mean, I know that studies of 911 call volume in multiple jurisdictions have suggested that somewhere between a third and fully 68% of police calls for service could totally be handled without sending an armed police officer, because so much is either mental health or sort of quality of life, low level stuff, or minor disputes that any level-headed human could pretty much resolve. So I'm wondering, in this discussion, as you talk about the importance of providing a wider array of emergency first responders through 911. And when I look at something like Oakland's macro program that will encompass mental health, but is also sort of intended to just be a general civilian response to like low level stuff where guns aren't necessary. Is there talk of doing more in Austin for more types of non-police requiring crises?
Yeah, I mean, part of what we expanded was not just the 911 immediate response, but our community health paramedics, which are teams of paramedics that go out and deal with issues proactively. Go and talk to people on the street that are have opioid addiction issues or experiencing homelessness, or who have mental health issues who need to be checked up on, to prevent those 911 calls in the first place. Because we don't want to just be a community that gets to the 911 call as fast as we can. We also want to be a community that reduces the amount that anybody feels like they have to call 911 in the first place. So when we readjusted our police funding, it was to this mental health program, but it was also to proactive medics in the community. It was also to house people experiencing homelessness in the first place. It was to harm reduction and substance use care, so that essentially we can say, look, we want to reduce the number of emergencies, not just speed up our overall response to them. Because in the case of folks experiencing homelessness, for example, if you send a police officer just because someone's unhoused, maybe they'll move that person from one street corner to another, but you've just wasted a resource. You've just potentially created a situation where somebody could get hurt, and you haven't helped reduce the problem. But if we take those same dollars and house that person, then you've fixed the problem that community members are wanting fixed in the first place. And so there's my vision, I think our vision is, yeah, let's look at that whole list of emergencies that people want to see responded to in the community, recognize that maybe 10% or less are on actual imminent issues of violence. And how do we actually start solving that other 90% and start chipping away at that, while also investing in the kinds of violence intervention and reduction programs to reduce that 10% as well? But like you said, it's not just mental health first response. There's so many other things that don't actually require handcuffs and a gun for us to solve. And not only do they not require it, handcuffs and a gun oftentimes don't even solve the issue itself.
Yeah, for our loyal viewers who already know this will be an unnecessary point. But if you are just dipping into the Appeal Live, you should go dig around on the internet and check out the last time we had Councilmember Casar on this show, which was when we were talking about a really unique, innovative solution to pandemic-related housing crisis, wherein people in need of housing are being housed in repurposed hotels. Hotels that were abandoned and not being used are now being used to create superior housing to what the options were before, which is really exciting because, as we know, it's a lot cheaper to house someone than to pay for police to continually throw people's belongings away and put them in jail. It's a totally different issue for another time, but I just want to note that it's Councilmember Casar on both of those issues and both of those shows coming up with innovative solutions in Austin. So let me ask you this. You're in Austin. It's this little shining blue city in a red state. And I know Governor Abbott has not been particularly enthusiastic about alternatives to police, and in fact has sort of threatened to punish cities for coming up with alternatives and solutions like this. How are you navigating a state environment that is so hostile to cities' abilities to reallocate their resources?
Yeah, we've been facing threats as a community for so many years from the state. And we can't back down, because then we're just doing exactly what they want, which is to continue the status quo and to not address the issues that are impacting our communities, especially working class and communities of color. And so, yeah, they've threatened to pass bills. They have a whole slew of bills that say slash their budgets, confiscate their local tax revenue, cut them off from grants, take over the police department, every sort of punishment they can come up with. They're trying to throw the entire book at cities that dare reform policing and reconsider their police budgets. But they're casting such a wide net because it's just such a politically motivated move that, in fact, 9 out of 10 of Texas's big cities would have been punished if some of these laws had been on the books in recent years. Because it just makes sense that every city, even if they're not doing something radical or creative, sometimes is going to reduce their police budget because, as we know, police aren't going to be able to solve every issue in a community. And so the bills that they are considering could potentially slash grants away from and confiscate revenue from Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, El Paso, communities that are known as more conservative, like Lubbock, could even fall under some of the punishments being laid out by the legislature. So again, we see how when people rise up and ask their local government to respond, it's on us to respond and then to push back against the really cynical and political attacks that we've come to expect from people like Governor Abbott.
So, all right, pushing past that state government level and going let's go over his head to the federal level. There's an effort in Congress to create a new program at Health and Human Services that would provide somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion per year in funding to support these types of programs. In the same way that DOJ has historically supported traditional law enforcement with grants, there's now going to be hopefully funding to support alternatives to law enforcement. So how important is this federal effort for the ability of cities and counties and states to expand these programs to scale? And have you had conversations with any of Texas's congressional delegation or others about how you can allocate extra funding for growing this effort?
It's such an important pivot for the Biden administration to be stepping up and funding these alternative programs. Because what we were used to is sometimes a federal grant being offered to a city. And if we said, hey, we want to put it to mental health services, we want to put it to helping folks dealing with addiction issues that sometimes winds up in the jail, we would hear, it has to go to policing. And the idea that there could actually be federal money that is not just for policing, but actually for getting to the root issues, to actually solving issues rather than just saying, let's lock more people up. It's critical. And I think it could really help communities that want to show that if we create these programs to replace traditional 911 police response, that creates the opportunity for us to reduce the number of police officers that we need on the street, because we actually have other folks that can respond to the community needs in the way that the community wants those calls dealt with.
So, Councilmember Casado, you mentioned this a minute ago, but I would like to give you a chance in closing to offer advice that any learnings you've taken away from this process. And also, if you want to give us a hint, now that I've talked with you about repurposing hotels and I've talked with you about new crisis response units, if you want to give us a teaser for what you're going to do next, that would be really cool too.
That sounds good. Well, my advice to local policymakers and those that advise them and push on them is that, the heat and people pushing back is going to come whether you cut the police budget by $1 or $25 million. And it's best to actually fund something that is going to help your community so that when people go back out on the campaign trail, you can show folks that there is something that's going to make their lives really and truly better. I think everyday people living in neighborhoods, I live and represent the district that has some of the highest number of 911 calls in the city. And in this area, people understand and know that police aren't going to be the ones that they want solving everything. They just want to see a more thoughtful response. And so I would say actually taking the time to make a significant enough shift in dollars that it makes a real difference and stands up a good program makes more sense than trying to do something small and symbolic that isn't actually going to solve the problem. So I really think the community is calling us in this moment to be bold and to step up and take that on. I also would suggest for folks to do a data analysis of their 911 calls and find out how many of them are mental health, because that really helped us make this shift, because we could point to the data and point to the numbers about why this is so necessary. So I would really recommend that folks take a look at that. As part of a teaser, as far as what we're working on next, pretty soon, I think we're going to use dollars from our police budget to expand a family violence shelter in our community. We haven't added family violence shelter beds in Austin in many years. And so hopefully in the month of May, we'll be taking that vote, because again, cities just hire more and more police officers to patrol a street up and down the street. That doesn't necessarily really prevent violence happening inside of a home. And we know that's a really big chunk of the violent crime that happens in a community is family violence. So creating resources for people to get out of those dangerous situations and have support and support people experiencing family violence and reduce that violence is another really critical way we can repurpose our police budget. So that's coming up here in the month of May, most likely here in the city of Austin.
Well, Councilmember Kassar, I hope you will come on the show and talk with us about what you're doing on that too. And then we're going to put these into like just a little series of like, what's Councilmember Kassar up to. But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming to share this amazing innovation on the show. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you all so much. Take care.
So what's exciting about my job is that I get to talk with people all around the country who are doing really interesting things in their localities. When we think about what we want out of our government, I think most people think about innovation. They think about creativity. They think about building a better world. They think of new solutions to our current problems. All of these things that require a great deal of creative force and creative power. But creativity is hard to navigate on a national scale. You're never going to know America's 3,000 counties well enough to know what is tailored to each one and works for each one and addresses the unique needs of each one. And that's why it's so exciting to get to talk to people like Councilmember Kassar, who are solving things at a local level in a way that can be replicated nationally. As he pointed out, this is in response to the demands of the people. It's in response to marches, to protests, to a new civil rights movement. So coming up from a grassroots perspective, responding to constituent demand, responding to the will of the voters, something that I think is all too rarely seen in this day and age, you get these innovations, like repurposing hotels, or like we talked about in this call, in a world where hundreds of thousands of mental health calls are hundreds of thousands of 911 calls are coming in, tens of thousands of those are for mental health crises. An innovation of separating police from 911, putting a clinician in 911 who can say, here we need someone who is not an armed police officer. Here we need someone who's a mental health counselor. Here we need someone who can create safety, who is not going to arrest a woman for refusing to let go of her dog, who is not going to, separate a family through deportation because of a mental health crisis. Councilmember Kassar talked about this initiative impacting up to 50,000 people in Austin annually. 50,000 lives that will not come into contact with police in this way because of one simple, straightforward, really reasonable innovation. And that's the sort of thing that's so exciting to talk about in this context, right? More effective solutions, ending crises and reducing the need for emergency response instead of continually funding more and more armed and violent response. Innovations in housing, policing, safety. Just now we heard about expanding family violence shelters. Of course, we all know that the way police respond traditionally to domestic violence leaves survivors of domestic violence really unsatisfied, and creating safe spaces and supportive resources is an essential innovation to, yes, move forward in a way that creates safety instead of falling back on old carceral mechanisms of response. So his advice to jurisdictions around the country, look at the data, get the data, and I'm going to paraphrase. I think what he basically said was don't half-ass it, get the money you need to actually make change, reallocate those funds, and do something smarter. It is my privilege to bring you innovations like this and ideas like this here on The Appeal Live, and I hope you will follow us on Facebook and Twitter for all the latest news. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.